In March of 1934, a water pipe burst beneath the floorboards of a farmhouse in rural Callaway County, Tennessee. When workers pulled up the rotting planks, they discovered something that would haunt investigators for decades: a collection of photographs wrapped in oilcloth, depicting wedding ceremonies that should never have taken place. Among them was a daguerreotype of a young woman in white lace, her belly swollen with child, standing beside a man who bore her exact features, down to the same crooked smile and distinctive cleft chin. Scrawled on the back in fading ink were two names: Evangeline Matthias Blackthorne, June the 21st, 1889. Below that, in different handwriting, God forgive us all. Before we dive into this forbidden chapter of American history, subscribe and comment which state you're watching from. Your support helps us uncover these buried truths that powerful families tried to erase forever. The first official record of the Blackthorne family appears in the 1870 Tennessee census, listing Ezekiel Blackthorne as a landowner with over 2,000 acres of mountain timber. What the census didn't record was far more disturbing. According to a sealed affidavit discovered in 1987, Ezekiel had fled Virginia after accusations of unnatural congress with blood kin threatened to destroy his family's reputation. The mountains of eastern Tennessee, wild and largely unsettled, offered the perfect refuge for a man seeking to escape civilization's judgment. Ezekiel's wife, Constance, had died during the journey west, leaving him to raise their 5 children alone in a valley so remote that the nearest neighbor lived 18 miles away. The isolation that protected them from scandal also warped their understanding of family bonds. Church records from the tiny Methodist chapel in nearby Hickory Ridge show that the Blackthornes attended services sporadically and rose. They did appear. The preacher noted their peculiar closeness and how the children seemed fearful of outsiders in ways that spoke of dark instruction. By 1875, Ezekiel had begun construction on what locals would later call the wedding house, a massive stone structure with rooms that defied conventional purpose. The blueprints preserved in the county courthouse show bedrooms connected by hidden passages, a chapel with no windows, and most disturbingly, a nursery designed with iron bars on the inside of the doors. When questioned about the unusual design by the local building inspector, Ezekiel reportedly replied, "My family keeps its own counsel, and our children learn their place early." The inspector's notes were damning, but they weren't the only record, because buried in the county coroner's files was a pattern that would horrify anyone who bothered to look closely enough. Dr. Amos Henley served as Callaway County's coroner from 1878 to 1903, and his private journals reveal a man slowly driven to madness by what he witnessed in the Blackthorne Valley. The first entry that mentions the family dates to October 1878. Called to the Blackthorne property for what was reported as a stillbirth. The infant, male, bore such severe deformities that I could scarce determine if it was human. Missing limbs, eyes fused shut, a skull that seemed to fold in upon itself. The mother, Sarah Blackthorne, appeared no older than 14, though Ezekiel insisted she was his daughter-in-law. When I asked to see the father, he pointed to a boy who could not have been more than 16, bearing such resemblance to the girl that they might have been twins. Dr. Henley's entries continue with disturbing frequency. November 1879, another stillbirth, another child mother, another father who shared her features. December 1880, triplets born alive but wrong in ways that defied medical explanation. The doctor's handwriting grows increasingly erratic as the years pass, his clinical detachment giving way to horror and desperation. The most damning entry comes from June 1881. I can no longer pretend ignorance of what transpires in that cursed valley. Today, I delivered the 4th child to Evangeline Blackthorne, age 15. The father stands beside her bed, her own brother Matthias, barely 17 himself. The child lives, praise God, but bears the mark of their sin in a face that seems to mock the very notion of innocence. Ezekiel speaks of keeping the bloodline pure and preventing the corruption of outsider influence. He quotes scripture with the fervor of the mad, twisting holy words to justify his unholy practices. But what Dr. Henley discovered next would drive him to take desperate measures that would echo through generations. In his final journal entry B, before his mysterious disappearance in 1903, Dr. Henley described a cache of photographs he'd stolen from the Blackthorne house during a medical call. "I have seen evidence of ceremonies that mock the sacred institution of marriage," he wrote. "Ezekiel has officiated at unions between his own children, his grandchildren, cousins no more than children themselves. The photographs show brides heavy with child standing beside grooms who share their blood so closely that they appear as mirror images. I have counted no fewer than 17 such ceremonies over the past decade." The photographs that workers discovered in 1934 were likely part of Dr. Henley's stolen collection, hidden beneath his own floorboards before his disappearance. Each image told a story more horrific than the last. A wedding between siblings so young they could barely reach the altar. A bride whose belly showed she was already carrying her brother's child. A groom who was simultaneously the father and uncle to his bride's previous children. The most disturbing photograph showed what appeared to be a double wedding. Two pairs of siblings exchanging vows simultaneously, while Ezekiel, now aged and wild-eyed, presided over the ceremony with a Bible that subsequent investigators would discover had been hollowed out to contain something far more sinister than Scripture. FBI agent Thomas Morrison, who investigated the case in 1934, wrote in his classified report, "The Blackthorne family appears to have operated as a closed genetic system for over 60 years. Medical examination of the surviving members reveals generations of systematic inbreeding that has produced physical and mental abnormalities consistent with severe genetic degradation. What's more troubling is the evidence of ritualistic behavior designed to perpetuate these unions, suggesting a deliberate and organized effort to maintain what they termed blood purity." Morrison's investigation revealed that the family had kept meticulous breeding records, tracking bloodlines like livestock breeders monitoring prize cattle. But the records contained details that would shake even hardened federal agents. Hidden in a root cellar beneath the chapel, investigators discovered a collection of leather-bound ledgers that read like a nightmare fusion of genealogy and livestock breeding records. Written in Ezekiel's careful script, the books tracked not just births and deaths, but detailed observations about the quality of offspring produced by various familial combinations. Matthias plus Evangelina produced strong children, though marked by the family weakness in the eyes, read one entry from 1883. Their son shows promise for future breeding with his cousin Sarah's daughter, though we must wait for her flowering. The closer the blood, the purer the line, but too close produces the twisted ones we must bury in the night. The ledgers revealed a systematic program of incestuous breeding spanning 4 generations. Ezekiel had divided his descendants into breeding lines, carefully planning marriages to maintain what he believed was genetic superiority, while attempting to minimize the obvious deformities that plagued many of the children. Girls were married off as soon as they reached puberty, often to their own brothers, fathers, or uncles. Boys were selected for breeding based on their physical strength and lack of obvious defects. Most chilling were the entries regarding children who failed to meet Ezekiel's standards. The Reeves boy, born of Matthias and his sister-wife, shows the mark of corruption: 6 fingers on each hand and eyes that do not track together. We will tell the others he died in birth and bury him where the roots grow thick. The ledgers contained dozens of such entries, suggesting that infanticide was common practice for children born with visible deformities. Agent Morrison's team discovered 17 unmarked graves in the woods behind the main house, each containing the remains of infants or young children. Forensic examination revealed that many had died not from natural causes, but from deliberate suffocation or blunt force trauma to the skull. The ledgers also contained detailed records of the family's isolation practices, designed to prevent outsiders from discovering their secrets and to keep family members from fleeing. But what investigators found in the basement of the main house suggested that isolation was enforced through methods far more sinister than simple geographic remoteness. The basement of the Blackthorne house contained what FBI investigators classified as detention facilities designed for long-term imprisonment. 3 windowless rooms, each barely large enough for a single person to lie down, showed evidence of prolonged occupancy. Scratches in the stone walls formed crude calendars marking days, months, and in some cases, years of captivity. The most disturbing room contained shackles sized for a child, along with evidence that suggested it had been occupied for extended periods. Carved into the wall above the chains was a message that haunted investigators. Mercy tried to run. Mercy learned. Mercy loves her brother now. Mercy carries his child. Cross-referencing with the breeding ledgers revealed that Mercy was Mercy Blackthorne, Ezekiel's youngest daughter, who had apparently attempted to escape the family compound at age 14. The ledgers showed that after 3 months in the basement room, she was wed to her older brother Silas and bore him 4 children over the next 6 years before dying in childbirth. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, a forensic psychologist who studied the case files in 1987, noted, "The Blackthorne family operated using classic cult indoctrination techniques, combined with physical imprisonment and psychological torture. Children were raised believing that marriage outside the family was a sin, punishable by eternal damnation, while marriage within the family was a sacred duty. Those who resisted were subjected to isolation, starvation, and physical abuse until they complied." The basement also contained what appeared to be a primitive surgical suite, suggesting that the family performed their own medical procedures rather than risk outside scrutiny. Bloodstains on the stone table told stories that investigators preferred not to imagine, though the ledgers contained references to procedures to ensure fertility and corrections for those born wrong. But the most horrifying discovery lay not in the basement, but in the family's private cemetery, where headstones revealed the true scope of their genetic nightmare. The Blackthorne family cemetery, located in a grove of ancient oaks behind the main house, contained over 200 graves dating back to 1873. What made the cemetery unique wasn't its size, but the relationships revealed by the headstones and the ages of those buried there. Evangeline Blackthorne read one stone, the repeated surname indicating she had married within the family and kept her birth name. Beloved wife, devoted sister, faithful daughter, age 19. The dates showed she had lived only 5 years after her wedding photograph was taken, dying shortly after the birth of her 4th child. Matthias Blackthorne, her brother-husband, had lived until 1923, marrying 2 more of his sisters after Evangeline's death, and fathering children with each of them. His headstone listed him as patriarch, brother, father, uncle, without apparent irony. The cemetery's most disturbing section contained the graves of children who had lived past infancy but died young. Their headstones told stories of genetic collapse. Josiah Blackthorne, age 7, never learned to walk. Mary Blackthorne, age 5, born silent, died silent. The twins. Blackthorne, born together, died together. God have mercy. FBI forensic specialists noted that nearly 30% of the children buried in the cemetery had died before age 10, a mortality rate consistent with severe genetic disorders caused by repeated inbreeding. Many of the headstones bore cryptic inscriptions like "The blood runs true" or "Purity preserved," suggesting that even these tragic deaths were viewed through the lens of the family's twisted ideology. Agent Morrison's team also discovered evidence that some graves had been disturbed and the bodies moved, leading to speculation that the family had engaged in even more disturbing practices than previously imagined. Chemical analysis of the soil revealed traces of quicklime, a substance commonly used to accelerate decomposition and eliminate evidence of foul play. The final section of the cemetery contained the most recent graves, dating to the 1930s, and it was here that investigators made a discovery that would reshape their understanding of the case entirely. The newest graves in the Blackthorne cemetery belonged to what appeared to be the family's final generation, and their headstones revealed that the genetic damage had finally reached a critical threshold. Baby Blackthorne, born sleeping, 1931, read dozens of identical stones, marking stillbirths that had become increasingly common as the family's gene pool contracted beyond the point of viability. The last living Blackthornes, when FBI agents arrived in 1934, were a brother and sister pair, both in their 20s, who had been married for 3 years but had produced only stillborn children. Medical examination revealed that both suffered from severe developmental disabilities, barely able to speak or care for themselves. Their condition was so deteriorated that agents initially mistook them for children despite their adult ages. More disturbing was the discovery that the sister, Rebecca Blackthorne, was pregnant at the time of the investigation. Medical tests confirmed that the father was indeed her brother, and that the fetus showed severe genetic abnormalities that would have made survival impossible. Dr. James Crawford, the physician who examined her, wrote, "The patient represents the end result of 60 years of systematic inbreeding. Her pregnancy, while viable in terms of basic biological function, carries genetic defects so severe that the fetus could not survive outside the womb even if carried to term." The investigation revealed that Rebecca had suffered through 7 previous pregnancies, all ending in stillbirth or infant death within days of birth. The family's breeding ledgers, maintained even by these intellectually diminished final survivors, recorded each failed pregnancy with the same clinical detachment as their predecessors, though the handwriting was barely legible and the entries increasingly disconnected from reality. Agent Morrison noted in his final report, "The subject Rebecca appears to believe that her inability to produce living children is due to insufficient devotion to family traditions. She has requested permission to marry her deceased brother's son, her nephew, in the belief that a purer union might result in viable offspring. The level of psychological damage inflicted by generations of abuse and indoctrination is beyond any case in FBI records." The investigation's conclusion would reveal secrets that the federal government decided were too dangerous to make public. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally classified the Blackthorne investigation in 1935, ordering all evidence sealed for 50 years. The official reason given was national security, but declassified documents from the 1980s reveal that the government's real concern was preventing copycat cases and avoiding public panic about the extent of inbreeding in isolated American communities. Internal FBI memos showed that the Blackthorne case was not unique. Similar families had been discovered in remote areas of Appalachia, the Ozark Mountains, and the desert Southwest, all following similar patterns of genetic isolation and systematic inbreeding. The Bureau feared that publicizing the Blackthorne case would lead to more intensive investigations of other isolated communities, potentially revealing a widespread problem that could damage America's international reputation. The surviving Blackthorne siblings were quietly transferred to a federal psychiatric facility in Georgia, where they lived under assumed names until their deaths in the 1940s. Rebecca's pregnancy was terminated, and both she and her brother were sterilized to prevent any possibility of further reproduction. The Blackthorne property was seized by the federal government under eminent domain and declared a restricted area. Official records list the reason for the seizure as environmental contamination, but internal documents reveal the truth. The government wanted to ensure that no evidence of the family's crimes could ever surface. The main house was demolished, the cemetery was dug up, and the remains relocated to an unmarked mass grave, and the entire valley was declared off-limits to civilian access. Dr. Hawkins, who studied the case decades later, wrote, "The Blackthorne case represents one of the most systematic and prolonged examples of familial abuse in American history. The government's decision to classify and bury the evidence may have prevented panic, but it also denied justice to the victims and prevented the development of protective policies that might have saved other children in similar situations." The cover-up was so complete that when historians began researching the case in the 1980s, they found that most records had been deliberately destroyed. The photographs discovered in 1934 had vanished from FBI evidence storage, the breeding ledgers had been accidentally incinerated, and even the medical records of the surviving family members had been sealed beyond the reach of researchers. But some secrets refused to stay buried. In 1987, Dr. Sarah Chen, a geneticist studying hereditary diseases in isolated populations, stumbled across a reference to the Blackthorne case in declassified FBI files. What she found launched a decades-long investigation that would reveal the true scope of America's hidden history of inbreeding and genetic abuse. Using advanced DNA analysis techniques unavailable to 1930s investigators, Dr. Chen's team examined tissue samples that had been preserved from the case. What they discovered was genetic damage so severe that it redefined scientific understanding of the effects of prolonged inbreeding on human populations. The Blackthorne family DNA showed evidence of at least 4 generations of systematic brother-sister marriages, Dr. Chen wrote in her 1992 study. The level of genetic homozygosity was so extreme that family members shared nearly identical genetic profiles, closer than identical twins. This level of inbreeding had resulted in the accumulation of lethal recessive genes that made viable reproduction virtually impossible. More disturbing was Dr. Chen's discovery that genetic markers found in the Blackthorne DNA were still present in the modern population of eastern Tennessee. Computer modeling suggested that descendants of the family had survived and integrated into local communities, carrying with them the genetic legacy of their ancestors' crimes. Dr. Chen's team also uncovered evidence that the FBI's 1930s investigation had missed critical aspects of the case. Church records from neighboring counties showed that the Blackthorne family had operated a network of similar families, sharing wives and husbands across bloodlines in what appeared to be a coordinated effort to maintain genetic isolation across multiple communities. The investigation revealed at least 6 other families in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia that had been connected to the Blackthornes through marriage and shared ideology. Some of these families had continued their practices well into the 1960s, producing generations of genetically damaged children who had been hidden from authorities and medical care. Dr. Chen's final report concluded, "The Blackthorne case represents not an isolated incident of abuse, but the visible tip of a much larger network of families that systematically practiced incest as a form of genetic and social control. The government's decision to classify this information may have prevented these practices from being identified and stopped in other communities." The report was submitted to the Department of Health and Human Services in 1995 and immediately classified. Dr. Chen was transferred to a different research program, and her team was disbanded. The genetic samples from the Blackthorne case were declared lost during a laboratory move, and funding for further research was quietly eliminated. Today, the Blackthorne Valley remains federal property, officially classified as a biological research station, despite the absence of any visible research activity. Satellite imagery shows only abandoned roads leading to empty clearings where the family's buildings once stood. The cemetery has been replaced by a small grove of planted pine trees with no markers to indicate what lies beneath. But locals in the surrounding area still speak of the Blackthorne curse, though most don't know the true history behind the legend. Stories persist of children born wrong, families that keep to themselves, and bloodlines that should never have been allowed to continue. Medical facilities in eastern Tennessee report higher than average rates of genetic disorders and birth defects, though no official studies have been conducted to determine the cause. In 2003, a group of genealogy enthusiasts attempting to trace family histories in the region discovered that records for several families dating back to the 1800s had been deliberately obscured or destroyed. Death certificates had been altered, marriage licenses had vanished, and census records showed suspicious gaps in population data. When they attempted to investigate further, they were informed that the records were part of an ongoing federal investigation and could not be accessed. Dr. Marcus Webb, a historian who has spent decades researching the case, believes that the Blackthorne story represents a deliberate effort by the federal government to hide evidence of widespread genetic abuse in rural American communities. The Blackthornes weren't unique, he argues. They were just the ones who got caught. There are probably dozens of similar families whose stories have been buried so deep that we'll never know the truth. Recent advances in consumer genetic testing have revealed troubling patterns in DNA data from certain regions of Appalachia and the rural South, with unusually high levels of genetic similarity, suggesting ongoing inbreeding in isolated communities. However, genetic testing companies have been prohibited from releasing this data to researchers, and attempts to study these patterns have been blocked by federal health authorities. The children and grandchildren of these hidden bloodlines are still out, there carrying in their DNA the evidence of their ancestors' crimes. They attend schools, work jobs, and raise families of their own, often unaware of the genetic time bombs they carry or the dark history that shaped their very existence. The Blackthorne case stands as a testament to humanity's capacity for self-destruction in the name of twisted ideals. In their obsession with maintaining pure bloodlines, Ezekiel Blackthorne and his descendants created a genetic nightmare that condemned generations to suffering, deformity, and early death. The government's decision to hide this history has ensured that the lessons of the Blackthorne tragedy remain unlearned, while similar abuses likely continue in hidden corners of America. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the Blackthorne bloodline didn't truly end in that psychiatric facility in Georgia. DNA analysis suggests that genetic material from the family spread into the wider population through children who escaped, relatives who fled, and connections that were never officially documented. Somewhere in the mountains of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia, descendants of Ezekiel Blackthorne walk among us, carrying within their cells the accumulated genetic damage of 60 years of systematic inbreeding.